I will ask you to hold your questions till the end of the session. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Jerome Kohn, known as Jerry, for those who are in the know, which I'm not. I just found out you were Jerry. So he will talk about the incursion of private interest into the public realm today, a trend which started with 19th century imperialism and hasn't stopped since. He is a trustee of the Hannah Arendt Blücher Literary Trust and the director of the Hannah Arendt Center at the New School for Social Research. He's also the editor of a series of volumes of Arendt's unpublished and uncollected works. He has written numerous essays on various aspects of her thought. As many of you know, Hannah Arendt has left a large body of unpublished and uncollected writings and correspondence, and Professor Kohn is engaged in editing these. So far, he has published 4 volumes: Essays in Understanding, 1930-1954, Responsibility and Judgment, The Promise of Politics, and The Jewish Writings with Ron Feldman, all with Schocken books. And many, many, many more are going to appear, we hope, deeply. So it pleases me to welcome you today.
Thank you, Marina, and it's a pleasure to be here today. Oh, is this on? Is it? Can you hear? Oh, okay. I wanted to start by asking you really, if you know how in the moment between sleep and waking, one sometimes sees, not unconsciously as in a dream, but prior to the actual consciousness of thought, images of intense clarity. Well, after Roger Berkowitz invited me to say a few words about the relevance of Hannah Arendt's analysis of late 19th century imperialism to a particular aspect of the world of the 21st century, which struck me as both intriguing and slightly tricky, since Arendt neither wanted or believed it possible to foretell the future. I saw such an image. In it, Hannah Arendt and Karl Marx were together in heaven, and she, gazing down upon our current financial crisis, tugged him by the sleeve. "Look here, Marx," she said, "they did it all by themselves. No revolution required." And though that image was not produced by thinking about it steered me in the direction of talking today about the they who did it all by themselves, but from a historical point of view which draws heavily on Arendt. First of all, what Arendt means by imperialism, I think it's important to make this distinction. It's not colonialism or national aggrandizement or empire building in the Roman sense. What she means, she calls expansion for its own sake, and that entails a new mentality, a new way of looking at man in the world, really a new Weltanschauung. She says that expansionism, as opposed to the age-old practice of conquest, was that rarest of things, an entirely new conception of politics, and the ironic reason is that in its origin, expansionism is not a political concept at all. On the contrary, it arose in the 19th century from the ever-expanding export of capital to the non-capitalist world. And that was economically necessitated by the accumulation of surplus, or as Arendt prefers to call it, superfluous money at home. Superfluous because surfeited domestic markets no longer had the capacity to make it productive. After the disastrous financial swindles of the 1860s and 70s, which were on a scale Bernie Madoff might admire, the need to protect their far-flung capital investments and the huge profits derived from interest on them, not only from unscrupulous swindlers, but also against different nations competing for the same markets inspired capitalists for the first time to insure their enterprises, that is, to back them up with political power. And it was then that nation-states, Britain foremost among them, also for the first time, mistook expansion for its own sake, an economic principle, as their own aim and goal. Arendt finds the well-known saying that the British Empire was acquired in a fit of absent-mindedness unfortunately true, the result not of political intentions, but of automatic economic processes. Now, a lot more might be said. This is a very complicated process, this incursion of economic principles into the public realm and their acceptance. It's very complicated, and I won't try to go into that in detail, but this is the way Arendt sums it up. The significant fact about this revaluation, the revaluation of politics, that is, which began at the end of the 19th century and is still in effect. She was writing this in 1950, thereabouts, is that it began with the application of bourgeois convictions to foreign affairs and only slowly was extended to domestic politics. Therefore, the nations concerned were hardly aware that the recklessness that had prevailed in private life and against which the public body always had to defend itself and its individual citizens was about to be elevated to the one publicly honored political principle. Now, that said, I want to turn for just a moment to in 1967 there was a new edition of her book on imperialism, and for which she wrote a preface. And in the preface, she sees an essentially non-political use of political power instantiated in America's war in Southeast Asia. That was at the time of the Vietnam War, when we were fighting the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong on a far, far distant continent. And she sees what we were doing there as a non-political use of political power. To put it negatively, she sees no analogy between the escalation of the war in Southeast Asia and Neville Chamberlain's appeasement of Hitler when he seated in Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland for the famous phrase, for the sake of peace in our time, which, when Hitler attacked Britain a couple of years later, appeared as futile as it was ill-fated, that appeasement. And that analogy was often, if you remember, some of you invoked in regard to Vietnam. They were, no more appeasement. We were going there to stop further communist aggression. And more recently, it was invoked again in regard to our invasion of Iraq, as if we were going there to stop any further terrorist attacks after 9/11. I thought the possibility that those misadventures were propelled by principles derived from private rather than public interests legitimized revisiting what Arendt says about the short-lived and first stage of imperial expansion. Short-lived because it began in 1884 and ended only 30 years later in 1914 with the outbreak of World War I. I thought the boomerang effect of their expansionism on Europe's nation-states in the First World War in Western history was suggestive vis-a-vis the relevance of Arendt's analysis of imperialism to the worldwide economic collapse of 2008. We hope to recover from that collapse by stimulating the economy with infusions of capital, of national capital, and initiating economic reforms, including oversight and regulation of financial institutions, without much heeding that the political restraints of our Constitution might have prevented it prevented it in the first place, as they also might have prevented Vietnam and Iraq. But I also thought we will do well in what I have to say now, to heed the last words of the 1967 preface, which are, no matter how much we may be capable of learning from the past, it will not enable us to know the future. No, okay. Power is among the oldest political concepts, indeed a conceptual pillar of all forms of government since Plato first defined them. But the question here concerns the power-thirsty individuals who desire the power of the state for their private benefit, rather than, as in the past, acknowledging public power as the common benefit of civil society in its entirety. In one of her most dramatic rereadings of political thinkers, Arendt finds both the origin and consequence of the encroachment of bourgeois values upon the public realm, and thus also 19th century imperialism, in the 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes, the only great thinker, in her words, who ever attempted to derive public good from private interest. Hobbes claims that private interest, when properly understood, is public good, and therefore writes Leviathan, which describes a commonwealth not based in divine law, the law of nature, or the law of social contract, as in traditional pre- or post-Hobbesian definitions of commonwealths, but which starts and ends in the accumulation of power. It is important to remember that Leviathan was written in a period of public instability in Britain due to the civil wars fought over the distribution of power between Crown and Parliament, followed by the regicide and then by the dictatorship. Hobbes designs Leviathan, whose familiar image literally incorporates its members. You know, the original frontispiece of Leviathan, it's reprinted either on the cover or inside most modern editions, is of a towering figure, Leviathan, but who is literally made out of men. That's why I think it's best to refer to these people as members of Leviathan, not as citizens or subjects or anything like that. But they seem to be literally members. So he writes that book, for that very famous book, for the sake of stability, and from a perspective that took 300 years to become fully valid. Now, that 300 years to become fully valid was certainly not the beginning of imperialism, but it was when Arendt was writing her own book, and that was very much about totalitarianism. Seeing this imperialism as, I think, probably the major element, didn't cause it, but the major element of totalitarianism in her view. But we are interested in the relevance of the analysis of imperialism to the economic crisis, right? And now we're looking at Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century. The bourgeoisie was only emerging in the 17th century as that class of society for which power is the accumulated control that permits the individual to fix prices and regulate supply and demand in such a way that they contribute to his own advantage. But the individual, being a minority of one, realizes that his private advantage depends on power acquired or accumulated from a majority. It follows from what Arendt calls the unequaled magnificence of Hobbes' logic that when every single man is driven by nothing but his own interest, then the thirst for power must be the fundamental passion of all men, and that therefore the answer to the question about power-thirsty individuals lies in the nature of man, that in which every human being shares equally. The equality of men to Hobbes, men and women, needless to say, to Hobbes is manifest in their equal ability to kill one another, whether by strength, duplicity, or conspiracy. Their consequent fear is the raison d'etre of Leviathan, a mortal god, in Hobbes' words, whose power overawes its members, thus providing them a life that is not solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Those famous words are usually read as describing life in the pre-political or post-political, or in any case, apolitical state of nature, but not by Arendt. On the contrary, she sees in them Hobbes' description of the lives of those who, in ruthless competition with each other, so crave the power of Leviathan that they willingly relinquish their political rights, whether as subjects of a monarchy or citizens of a republic. This Hobbesian man would not be capable, this man supposedly in the state of nature, capable of constituting a polity in which his opinion counts as much but no more than any other, which can only mean that Leviathan is not a polity, but so overwhelming a power that admits no diversity of opinion. Leviathan is designed as the national security state par excellence, and hence, logically, is owed no loyalty by its members if it is defeated in war, just as those it imprisons for capital or lesser crimes are excused from every treachery against it. Leviathan weaves no bonds of fellowship, responsibility, or solidarity, the traditional sources of political power, between its members, because none of them has a right to justice under law, law being nothing but Leviathan says it is, without any consideration of justice. In short, Hobbes admits his commonwealth is a tyranny. He's happy to admit that. The classic perversion of polities, in which men retain the one right embedded in their fear of death, or non-success, as Arendt would have it, the natural right to defend themselves if, under any circumstances, the absolute power of Leviathan, which they jointly sustain for their security and profit, threatens them. So as it turns out, the stability of Leviathan is provisional, to say the least, and this is where Arendt's reading of Hobbes becomes really interesting. When power is considered a means to an end, such as safety or security or profit, it must constantly increase to guarantee the status quo, because insofar as it achieves its ends, power will atrophy if it has nothing left to overcome. It will, in Arendt's words, collapse into the chaos of the private interests from which it sprang. So Hobbes restores the condition of perpetual war, the bellum omnium contra omnes, not to individual men, but to individual states. In Arendt's ironic words, the ever-present possibility of war lends Leviathan a prospect of permanence, increasing its power at the expense of other states. Similarly, when a free market economy, which theoretically rejects state intervention, requires, as it has recently, precisely that intervention, the bourgeois mentality becomes liberal. And in fact, in the late 19th century, it was liberals rather than conservatives who supported imperialism. That is what Hobbes foresees, but it's only half the story. If the power of Leviathan transcends political limits, it is no less true that the individual, in Hobbes' words, cannot assure the means to live well, which he hath at present, without the acquisition of more. But, and here's the rub, property is not unlimited. Not only is it finite in terms of the earth's resources, but it also constantly diminishes through the use and consumption of those resources, as we know pretty well today. For that reason, property is redefined as wealth, the beginning rather than the result of acquisition. Wealth, as King Midas discovered when the apple he wanted to eat turned into gold, is not itself consumable. In a chilling metaphor, Arendt likens imperialists' lifeblood to gold, for as life begets life, so money begets money. Thus, there are two dynamic processes going on concurrently: a seemingly infinite increase of private wealth and a seemingly infinite increase of imperial power. But both are delusions, for mortality concludes the one and self-destruction the other. The point is not that an individual's lifespan limits the growth of wealth, but that to exceed all personal needs, wealth borrows from the public realm the indefinite length of time needed for continuous accumulation, and thereby ceases to be a private interest, except in name, as if, for instance, in the Ford Foundation or the Morgan Chase Bank or the Sloan School of Economics, and millions of examples. The progress, however, of even enlightened self-interest is delusive, a compromise between political action and faith in wealth as a self-moving principle. That to me is maybe trying to what I'm saying. The progress of even enlightened self-interest is delusive. A compromise between political action and faith in wealth is a self-moving principle. Hobbes sees that an endless acquisition of wealth corresponds to an endless acquisition of power, the result of which, to Arendt, is the blind conformism of a bourgeois society, or whatever you want to call that society today, wherein men rob themselves of their ability to act together to alter events. Hobbes foresees the course of events leading to a final war, which provideth for every man by victory or death. But even if Leviathan were victorious and imperial expansion consummated in such a war, neither can exist without more material to devour. When it has nothing to devour, imperialism enters upon what Arendt calls the road to suicide. For only by destroying itself can the process of generating power begin anew. That may follow from the magnificence of Hobbes' logic, but will it necessarily transpire in the world? Are we already imperialists, as Gary Wills assumes in a recent article entitled Entangled Giant, very interesting article too? Or are we citizens of a republic with enough freedom left between us to interrupt automatic economic political processes? I suspect there's evidence for both views. Thank you.